The second process is developing the portfolio charter, and the portfolio charter is created and the portfolio structure is defined. So what are the key outcomes of this process? Actually, it is the portfolio charter, but the most important part of this charter will be the portfolio structure. The portfolio charter is produced through this process to authorize the portfolio manager to apply the portfolio resources to portfolio components and to execute the portfolio management processes. This is why I told you to consider the portfolio charter as the internal agreement between the portfolio manager and the executive management of the organization. Once this charter is developed and approved, this will authorize the portfolio manager to use the portfolio resources or the organizational resources to the components to execute the portfolio management processes. The structure then is developed based on strategies and priorities, and portfolio components are grouped to facilitate effective management. The structure identifies the portfolio, sub-portfolios, programs, and projects based on organization areas included, hierarchies, timelines, and goals for each program, project, and operation to align with the portfolio strategic plan. Now, once the portfolio structure is defined, updates will be needed to the strategic management plan and portfolio process assets to ensure goals and standards alignment. Now, the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs of this process, you will have three inputs: the portfolio strategic plan, which is an output of the previous process, in addition to the portfolio process assets and the enterprise environmental factors, two tools and techniques of this process. And I had one question in my exam about the tools and techniques used in the develop portfolio charter process. They are the scenario analysis in addition to the capability and capacity analysis. The key outputs are the portfolio strategic plan updates, the portfolio process assets updates, and the portfolio charter. The key output is the portfolio charter. Now, the data flow diagram of this process showing that the inputs will come from the developed portfolio strategic plan and from the portfolio documents and from the enterprise or the organization. The outputs which are mainly represented by the portfolio process assets updates and the portfolio charter, which both will be part of the portfolio documents, and the portfolio charter, which is the outcome of this process, will be used in the defined portfolio roadmap process and manage strategic change. So the first input will be the portfolio strategic plan. When developing the portfolio charter and defining the portfolio structure, it's important to be guided by the portfolio strategic plan. So your guide in this process in order to develop an aligned charter will be the portfolio strategic plan. The information in the portfolio strategic plan necessary for developing the portfolio charter is the portfolio vision and objectives, the benefits expected, and the key risks, dependencies, and constraints. Within the portfolio strategic plan, the prioritization model is useful as a decision framework to structure the portfolio components. So you will rely on the prioritization model, which is part of the portfolio strategic plan, and you will rely on it in this process in order to structure the portfolio components. The second input is the portfolio process assets. In order to develop the portfolio charter, the portfolio manager should leverage the portfolio's plans, policies, procedures, and guidelines, and any existing documentation of stakeholder relationships, scope, benefits, and portfolio goals. And the third input will be the enterprise environmental factors, which may consist of corporate, environmental, and governmental variables that may contribute to and constrain the developed portfolio charter process. The portfolio structure, which is part of the charter, may need to align with the corporate accounting structure or with the functional structure of the organization. So we need to have the organizational structure or the organizational hierarchy to develop the portfolio structure. So you will need these three inputs, and you will apply two tools and techniques, starting with the scenario analysis. It's a data analysis technique. It's an analytical method which enables decision makers to create a variety of portfolio scenarios using different combinations of both potential components and current components, evaluating their possible outcomes based on various assumptions, and the result of this analysis allows decision makers to determine the portfolio structure and objectives for inclusion in the portfolio charter. So in order to determine which components should be part of your portfolio, you need to conduct the scenario analysis. The scenario analysis will provide the key decision makers with multiple scenarios with a mix of the current and future components of the portfolio in order to select the best scenario. The second technique is the capability and capacity analysis, and it is performed first to analyze the capacity. The capacity is how much work is the organization able to be performed based on the resources available. So the capacity analysis is to determine how much work is able to be done based on the current resources of the organization, while the capability analysis is the ability of the organization to source and execute the selected portfolio and to determine the constraints generated by certain skill set limitations, financial constraints, and other asset capacity factors. This is the capability. So in order to decide which components should be part of the portfolio structure, what are the programs and the projects and the operations the organization can execute, you need to understand the current capacity and capability of the organization by conducting this analysis. Internal resource capacity is required to be measured, and external resource availability is required to be established to complete the portfolio structure. These human resource, financial, and asset capacity considerations will be limiting factors for the number and size of portfolio components that the organization can execute. So we cannot just select the components that fits the portfolio and it's aligned with the organizational strategy. We need to be aware of the current capability and capacity of the organization to select the right fit of components. Now, the key outputs of this process are the portfolio strategic plan updates. Some updates might occur to the strategic plan to reflect the resulting changes from defining the portfolio structure, and the portfolio structure is the key section of the portfolio charter. Some examples of those updates and changes to the strategic plan may include changes in the organization areas, updates to the organizational structure of the portfolio, as well as updates in relationships, dependencies, and goals of the portfolio components. All these are examples of updates that might occur to the portfolio strategic plan as an outcome of this process. The second output, and it is the key output of this process, is the portfolio charter. It's the document that formally authorizes the portfolio manager to apply portfolio resources to the portfolio components. The charter provides the portfolio structure, including the hierarchy and organization of the portfolio, sub-portfolios, programs, projects, and operations, and forecasts how and when the portfolio will deliver value to the organization. So what is the portfolio structure which will be part of the portfolio charter? It's the hierarchy and the organization of the portfolio and the other components. Chartering a portfolio will link the portfolio to the organizational strategy, and it will describe how the portfolio will deliver value to the organization. Now, what are the key components of a properly developed portfolio charter? First of all, the portfolio objectives, then the justification. Why do you need to execute this portfolio? Who are the sponsors? What are the portfolio management roles and responsibilities? Who are the key stakeholders? What are the stakeholders' expectations and requirements? If there is any communication requirements, high-level scope of the portfolio, the expected benefits, the critical success criteria, the resources, the high-level timeline, and assumptions, constraints, dependencies, and risks. So somehow it is similar to the project charter. You will have the high-level information describing your portfolio. The last output will be the portfolio process assets updates, and the portfolio process assets usually includes formal and informal plans, policies, procedures, and guidelines which may need to be updated. The portfolio structure itself may be considered a guideline to identify the portfolio and sub-portfolios based on organization areas, hierarchies, and goals for each portfolio component. So the key output of this process is the portfolio charter, which will be a very useful input to multiple portfolio management processes.